Well, hello, boys and girls, and welcome to another scintillating, didactic, and provocative discussion of business and its environment. Today, we're looking at globalization, trade, and corruption. Wow! So, we're talking about some really hot button issues, right? Well, now, currently, not only in Congress, but certainly in the executive branch, White House, and throughout the world, trade is an ongoing topic of intense discussion and negotiation. So we've recently seen the U.S. withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty. And so this has really been quite an interesting conversation because these partnerships, these treaties, have been, have seen at least 9 countries in Southeast Asia sign up to them. And while the U.S. is backed out, China is looking to replace us. And so the question is posed, is trade a good thing? And I think history is a fairly good teacher. I think it's often said that when the United States economically catches a cold, Europe and the rest of the world catches pneumonia. And so we certainly saw this in 1929 with our Great Depression. What happened? Well, Congress certainly overreacted by enacting enormous tariffs in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 that placed enormous tariffs on exports to the United States. Well, guess what happened regarding United States exports to Europe and the rest of the world? Those countries retaliated by raising similar tariffs. So what happened? Trade came to a grinding, halt. And so Europe wasn't trading with the U.S. anymore because of the tariffs, and the U.S., was unable to export because of these tariffs. So it was a mutually depressing experience. And so we've seen this movie before. And so the idea of erecting tariffs or starting trade wars usually doesn't end well. And so the ongoing negotiations regarding NAFTA are clearly important, not just to Mexico and Canada, but certainly to the United States. South Dakota exports most of its, or much of its, agricultural products to, Canada. So we certainly would be impacted significantly if NAFTA goes away and tariffs become a common thing, because certainly there are going to be reactions, that is retaliation, if you will. So I think most educated people realize that the economists have it right, that reciprocal trade is good for all nations because it incentivizes each to, focus on their comparative advantage. Now, you all know that from Econ 101 and 102, right? Well, why is trade important? Why doesn't each nation just focus on being self-sufficient? Well, again, history is a good teacher. So what happened after 1930? Clearly, the whole world went into an economic depression. And eventually, by the time of September 1939, we ended up in a global, war, involving not just Germany and Japan and the United States and Great Britain, but virtually every other nation on earth. Well, there were some lessons, from that in the economic area that we should pay attention to, because if one is trading with another country, it certainly is bad for business for countries to go to war. And so, as a maxim, war is bad for business, and business detests war. A good example, I think, is the European Union. Now, from your studying world history that, over the centuries, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and 20th centuries, Europe was at war with itself from time to time. Well, with the creation of what became known as the common market, which evolved into the European Union, everybody is trading with each other. And so France, which has an enormous agricultural economy, sells much of it to Germany and other developed countries. Germany, which is an industrial country, sells much of its industrial goods to France. And so it becomes economic insanity to think that Germany or France would go to war with one another because it would create economic suicide. And so it has had a very positive effect in terms of maintaining peace. We've seen United States companies become multinationals, discussing them in previous classes. But McDonald's is a interesting, case in point, where we started out in California with Roy Kroc's first McDonald's store, and that's what they call their restaurants, stores. And now we've got them in 117 nations. And certainly everybody recognizes the golden arches everywhere in the world, right? And so is this a bad thing in terms of globalization? I think most people would say this is a great thing. People get to have the same product that they enjoy worldwide in 117 nations, while at the same time obviously being profitable. Even Russia opened up a McDonald's store in Moscow, which is one of the biggest stores in the world. So there certainly are cultural differences that have to be taken into account. So for example, in McDonald's stores in foreign nations, in a number of countries like Germany and France, for example, you'll find that they serve wine and beer, where in the United States they do not. Hey, cultural differences. Europeans enjoy having beer or wine with their meals. It's a cultural, customary staple where, we are different with respect to that. Has McDonald's had an impact on other cultures? Certainly. Their whole idea of, clean restrooms, for example, and birthday celebrations for children, are certainly cultural improvements that have had an impact abroad. All good things, right? And certainly, local entrepreneurs, running these franchises have profited from them. And so even though, of course, they adapt to local customs, these are all good things. These are good things for all parties involved. Well, our French philosopher Voltaire would say, hey, globalization, is when networks of economic, political, social, military, scientific, or environmental interdependence grow to span worldwide distances. So before, of course, we had oceans that impeded the development of trade, but as transportation grew and trade became sophisticated, we were able to spread our institutions, our economic development, and of course, this improves civil society. We have developed countries, we have developing countries, and we certainly have underdeveloped countries. But trade historically has been a positive thing. So as you read in preparation for today, the International Globalization Index measures trends in economic, political, and social dimensions. Clearly, this has been rising since 1970. No big surprise, right? And so certainly with the advent and increase in technology, we are seeing, trade continue to increase. And so contrary to some protectionists, anti-traders, if you will, in the United States, I think most economists would agree trade is a very good thing. As I mentioned before, it's also interconnected to maintaining world peace. And so rather than discuss among nations what they disagree on, I think historically it is important to focus on what they should agree on, and trade is a good activity for that purpose. So my argument, and I'm a believer in this, that the mainspring of globalization is trade. And when nations trade, even though you have dominant nations that are obviously have more goods to sell than developing nations, these are good relationships to develop, if you will, win-win propositions. We even saw our own trade take off after, the 19th century industrial revolution occurred. So we know historically in our own case, hey, trade works for us, and it works for the free world. And history supports that. So we've seen the creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, have all been set up to encourage, improve, foster, create trade, because trade is considered as a norm to be a good thing economically and civilly for societies. Now, let me introduce you to the most favored nation principle, which is a basic trade principle that if one participant, that is, one nation state, extends any benefit to another, that participant, that nation state, has to extend them to all. That's simply referred to as the most favored nation principle, and certainly that's what we see with the European Union, and we'll talk more about those regional unions in just a moment. The national treatment principle is that once inside a domestic market, foreign goods have to be given equal treatment with local goods. And we'll see that with our case today regarding Antigua. And of course, and I don't think the president is wrong on this at all nations want fair trade. Now, what constitutes fair trade, of course, depends on negotiations, right? Clearly, if you don't have fair trade, then of course you're going to have little incentive to trade in the first place. And so why enter into a bad agreement just for the sake of getting an agreement? I don't think reasonable minds would say that makes sense. And so ultimately, when nations enter into bilateral agreements between themselves regarding trade, they're each certainly exercising their comparative advantage. And while they may not be, 50-50 in terms of balance of payments and whatnot, at the end of the day, are both nations satisfied with the arrangement? Now, NAFTA is a good example of three nations, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, that we entered into this treaty in the early 1990s to reduce and ultimately eliminate tariffs and quotas regarding exports and imports to one another's, countries. Now, as with all treaties, they need updating as, decades, pass on and economic circumstances change. And so I think fundamentally that's where we are with NAFTA right now, is we're essentially renegotiating updates to the NAFTA treaty. However, once in a while you come in with some interesting negotiating tactics, like the U.S. wants to eliminate the requirement that if you have a trade dispute, you go to arbitration instead of litigation. Well, the U.S. point on that seems odd, because in all arbitration disputes thus far, the United States has won 100% of them. And so why would the U.S. want to discard a dispute resolution system that has worked very successfully for us? I think most trade experts would say, I think it's all about a negotiation ploy or advantage, that we'll trade that issue away for something else we deem far more important. So the whole point of our trading history that I think has produced peace internationally in much of the world has been that over time there have been major tariff and quota reductions, resulting in the expansion of world trade. Now, the World Trade Organization succeeded the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to facilitate and help nations develop the most favored nation principle to improve trade. It has 153 members, so you can see, hey, this is a popular organization. Now, negotiation sessions of these nations are simply referred to as rounds, if you will, meetings, which occur from time to time, again, trying to increase trade among the 153 nations. Clearly, the current political administration is giving a shock effect to the WTO and its members right now. And so it's an exciting time in reading your Wall Street Journal as to changes that are, going to be taking place, such as withdrawal from the partnership, the Southeast Asia Partnership Agreement. And so I think it's a story that is ongoing, and reading your Wall Street Journal will keep you up to date on that. Now, in negotiations, they are what they are. Each side is negotiating to advocate and support its comparative advantage over the parties that it's negotiating with. Hey, this is the essence of negotiation, right? Less developed countries certainly feel that they're not on an equal plane, which of course they're not, with developed countries. And so, Belize, when it negotiates a trade treaty with the United States, well, they're not on an even playing field with us. But nobody says they have to agree with us. The good thing about trade is you can trade with anybody. You don't have to trade with one particular country. You can shop partners, trading partners, which is, what everybody does. So certainly, regional trade agreements are permissible, like the European Union is the best example. And one of the reasons why I love the European Union of 28 members is peace. I think that is the one thing, in history, war has been endemic in Europe. And what I think the European Union trade agreements have brought about is peace in Europe. Nations that you rely upon for resources and sustenance, it's insane to, attack someone who is providing you your life sustenance. And so the advantage of free trade agreements is that, those that sign up to them eliminate import duties and other barriers to trade. Now, the European Union has a very sophisticated system for its 28 member states. What's really one of the many great things about their system is it's eliminated borders. You can go from Poland to Germany. There's no stop. There's no passport checking. You can go, back and forth. And so it's sometimes referred to as the United States of Europe. There is, of course, certainly arguments that some regional trade agreements discriminate against non-member countries. Well, sure they do. They discriminate. The European Union's got 28 members in its membership, and certainly Great Britain, which is trying to do this Brexit now, that's the key issue that they have to grapple with is, well, if they withdraw from the European Union, which they're attempting to do, what's the trade impact going to be on them? Because clearly the other 27 members do not want to continue providing Great Britain the even playing field in trade, if they're not going to be assuming the burdens that go with EU membership. So certainly free trade is the opposite of protectionism. Protectionism being, hey, let's, try and be self-sufficient, to heck with everybody else. But, we've learned a long time ago that protectionism hurts our own economy, and that trade increases and benefits our economy. Now, clearly the United States, over a period of time, since we're a consumer economy, has engaged in what we simply refer to as trade deficits. That is, we import and buy more goods than we export. Well, those are issues that the government needs to spend more time working on, and to their credit, the Trump administration has got essentially all treaties under review. And stay tuned and read your Wall Street Journal, because you're going to learn more about potential changes that are coming about. Again, trade barriers certainly represent a nation's industrial policy, and the recent tariff restrictions that are going to be applied to steel and aluminum imports, there are going to be some repercussions or impacts from those. Well, in the short term, steel plants in Pennsylvania may be happy about the 25% and 10% tariff restrictions that are going to be imposed on imports to the United States. To every action, there's a reaction, and there's going to be, I could see, tariffs being placed against U.S. agricultural goods that are attempting to be exported to China and elsewhere. And so South Dakota, being a animal husbandry and agricultural focused state, I predict we're going to feel that particular disagreement. And so trade wars are first and foremost bad for business. I don't think you'll find anybody other than perhaps the president who thinks trade wars are a good thing. War is bad for business, is a maxim. Any type of war. So I think you have to be careful of rhetoric, saying things that you don't mean, because obviously people can misjudge your intentions. And clarity when you negotiate, I think, is important, as well as good faith. So a nation, of course, is supposed to back up its rhetoric, what it says that it believes and does, with its tariff policy, its quota policy of how many of a certain item it will permit to be imported, prohibitions, so for example, certain technology prohibitions. We won't permit certain types of technology to be exported. And then, of course, Congress is forever putting in Buy American provisions in federal budgets, so that if the Air Force wants to buy a new fighter plane, an F-35, it can only buy one made in the United States. And so, but we're not alone in having those types of buy your national goods protection requirements. The issue is, of course, there needs to be some reasonable connection to national policy. So you can see national defense being a legitimate reason for why you would have Buy American requirements in federal appropriations laws. So certainly there are protectionist deviations from free trade policy. Certainly Japan, with respect to its prohibitions on import of U.S.-made cars. China has lots of them. South Korea, I mean, virtually everybody has limitations on their free trade, policy. That brings us to the discussion of corruption. Corruption. Just like war, corruption is bad for business. as we're going to see. So what is corruption? It is fundamentally the debasement of integrity for money, position, privilege, or other self-benefit. It's a widespread trade barrier. Cheating, right? It's trade cheating. Now, who wants to engage in trade cheating? Reasonable minds should say, nope, trade cheating is bad. We want an even playing field while everybody, wins and loses on different issues. But corruption, debases the whole negotiation and treaty, process. And certainly corruption raises the cost of doing business and distorts markets. How about this? The World Bank says, look, corruption expenditures are 5% of the global GDP. Wow, that's a big number. So obviously there is a continuum of corruption going from obviously being small, minor corruption to massive scale ones. So let's talk about some types of corruption. So first of example, what are facilitating payments? These are small amounts of money that minor officials demand and require in order to do their jobs. Let me give you an example. Now, in the United States, our public servants, whether they be state or federal, civil service employees, are paid adequately well. And so you rarely run across accusations of corruption by federal or U.S. State civil servants. However, when you get into what we simply refer to sometimes as third world nations, you find public officials are paid very poorly, below even the national standard. And over a period of time, they've created a custom that, look, if you want me to do my job, you're going to have to pay me a little money under the table for me to hustle this particular project along. So let me give you an example. When I was in Korea for 2 years, I learned that if a Korean wished to get a passport so they could travel abroad, it would take them a year to get a passport from the government. However, if they paid a $100 facilitating fee, they could get their passport within 10 days. Interesting, but that is very common in developing countries. And so you have to figure out and work within those situations. Certainly there are extortionate bribes that are requested and paid in some of the world's corrupt nations. And I think Russia is probably my premier example. I've warned lots of would-be entrepreneurs not to do business in Russia because they're corrupt. And if you want to do business, you're going to have to pay enormous bribes to all sorts of people in order to try and get your product, sold, unloaded, or produced, or whatever. And the problem is you have to keep on paying. So yeah, it's true, corruption exists, based on demand and supply. Certainly is bad for business, and business has to make up its mind as to not, it's going to play the bribery game. Now, facilitating payments are one thing. Just out and out bribes, as with the Boeing situation, where Boeing was negotiating with some Japanese entities to buy some of their planes for Japan Air, and massive bribes were demanded and paid by Boeing, and Boeing got caught doing that. And as we're going to see, we have a federal law that prohibits that type of behavior. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has called on its member nations to punish bribery, try and stamp it out by maintaining better records of financial transactions and, of course, refusing to play the game. So all of these world economic entities have anti-corruption measures because, again, this is bad for business worldwide. Now, I alluded to earlier a federal law that we have, which was actually enacted as far back as 1977, that prohibits U.S. business officials, business entities, from paying bribes. It is actually a civil and a criminal offense for an American to pay an official of a foreign government or a ministry or a member of a political party or even a candidate for office. So what constitutes bribery? Bribery is the mere making or offering to make a payment of money for anything of value with the corrupt intent to influence an official act, like the Boeing airplane sales to Japan Airlines that were going to require certainly some Japanese official approval. That was certainly illegal under the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now note that this federal law applies not only to U.S. executives and corporations anywhere in the world, but also applies to U.S. Employees abroad. Now, again, distinguish bribes from facilitating payments, okay? So facilitating payments, as I alluded to earlier, are payments to move along routine government action, like my passport illustration, right? It's going to happen anyway, but we are greasing the skids to get it done more quickly. I want the passport in 10 days, not a year. Okay, there's a fee for that. Now, believe it or not, even our U.S. passport office has that rule. So if you want to get a passport, it's going to take you several months. But if you want to pay a special fee, which I think is also about $100, you can get it, in 10 days. It's a facilitating payment, okay? Not a bribe. Bribes paid to managers by one corporation to another are not affected by this law because these folks aren't officials that they're paying the money to, officials of the foreign government. So if you want to prevent corruption, how do you go about it? Certainly having company policies against bribery is important, especially when you're doing business overseas. Setting up ethics and compliance programs. Even the Department of Defense, since I joined it in 1976, had an annual ethics and compliance program that everybody, regardless of rank, civilian, military, had to attend a 2-hour ethics training program every single year. It was required. Certainly training your employees if you're going to do business, and I've warned, people about doing business in Russia. You're going to find people who are going to want you to pay these agents' fees, and these people are going to pop up all the time, going to drive you nuts. And so, do you really want to do business in a corrupt environment that doesn't even have a legitimate legal system that you can rely on for vindicating property rights? So certainly I think it's critical that you have to study very carefully the foreign market that you are considering entering into before you do, business there, because you may discover once you get in pretty deep that you're in trouble. I always recommend that when you're doing business abroad, that you always get a local partner. Going it alone in a foreign business enterprise, I think, is highly risky. But if you get a legitimate local partner business, could be an agent, could be a broker, hopefully somebody who will share the risk, so your interest and theirs are aligned together. So they don't want to pay bribes any more than you want to pay bribes. But there may be a need for facilitating, payments, which they'll, explain to you why, in order to move this along, we need to, pay this government servant a facilitating fee. So you had a chance to read about the interesting U.S. and Antigua and Barbuda case where we had the United States signing a multilateral, that means a multi-nation trade agreement, um, called the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, that was monitored, or if you will, supervised by the World Trade Organization, to which, of course, the U.S. belongs, along with 152 other nations. So what does this treaty that we signed up to require? It requires us to open our borders to online gambling enterprises that happen to be also sheltered in the Antigua by the Antigua government. In other words, online gambling was legal in Antigua, which is a Caribbean nation, right? So doing so would certainly open the United States to a huge market for foreign companies offering, online betting that American firms could not legally offer because we had domestic laws that limited what types of gambling we would permit. So after 4 years of argument, the U.S. actually lost its case. But the U.S. refused to open its borders to the online betting parties, which opened it to retaliation under the GATS agreement. That is, if you don't, adhere to the GATS agreement, there are consequences. So it does illustrate how the WTO tries to resolve trade disputes. So looking at the case, you've got this Jay Cohen, right, who's running this online betting operation in Antigua, and he gets charged with violating U.S. laws when he attempts to enter the U.S. market with his online operations. So he gets arrested and tried, and under the Wire Wager Act of 1961, he was accused of violating it because it prohibited wire communications for betting within the U.S. Or between the U.S. and a foreign country. So he's in Antigua, got his company there, trying to run this operation from there into U.S. markets. So it was pretty cut and dry factual case, in that Antigua sanctioned, that is, permitted online gambling, whereas the United States, made it criminal. So what happened? Of course, there was a complaint by Antigua to the World Trade Organization. The complaint was that, hey, look, the U.S. is not playing by the rules that it signed up to, and that the United States is defying the World Trade Organization and this GATS agreement with respect to online gambling, even though we had domestic law that prohibited it. So, you can, ask the question, well, do you agree with what the World Trade Organization decided? Well, let's look at the 3 decisions affecting the case. So we're all the way back to 2004, where we had a dispute panel that found that the United States had violated the GATS agreement, even though the United States had committed itself to opening up its borders to international gambling services by signing the agreement. Yet even as the U.S. allowed certain forms of gambling, which of course, we do have, we'll talk more about that, it criminalized cross-border internet gambling. So this was deemed by the GATS and by the World Trade Organization to be an illegal trade restriction. So objectively applying the GATS, the U.S. did violate it. On the other hand, the GATS agreement would certainly interfere with a long-standing body of U.S. domestic law regarding gambling. So the question becomes, geez, does the United States support the states' rights to uphold anti-gambling, online gambling laws, or does it need to overturn all those? And so it appealed. An appellate body of the WTO dismissed the U.S. argument, finding that, look, you guys signed up to this, treaty. That it happens to violate your domestic law is a domestic problem. But hey, look, you're, technically violating that. So the U.S. was given a year to comply with the WTO rulings. Now, it could do that by one of two ways. It could obviously change its domestic laws to permit cross-border internet betting, or it could ban all domestic online gambling, including horse racing. And that was the key issue, that horse racing, online gambling, was permitted in the United States. But it prohibited other types of online gambling, and that's where it ran into conflict with the GATS. So instead, Congress decided to defy the WTO by passing the Federal Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006 to block bank payments for online bets, with the exception of horse racing bets. So the U.S. wanted it, two ways. It wanted to accept horse racing bets online. Yeah, that's legal and okay, but any other type of online betting is not okay. Well, you can see you're going to have a conflict there between the U.S. and the GATS. Well, Antigua requested retaliation, leading to a third decision, because clearly if you don't follow the GATS and you violate it, then under the GATS, injured parties can claim damages. Well, how much damages? Well, the arbitration panel of the WTO said, okay, the Antigua could retaliate against the United States by copying and selling up to $21 million of trademarked and copyrighted music, films, and software. How about that? That's really an unusual type of remedy, right? So they were trying to hold the U.S. Accountable. Well, is that a bad precedent? That copyrighted material is going to be used to, in retaliation, going to be used here to remedy this alleged violation. So, as you can see, Antigua sought to impose concessions valued at $3.44 billion. They thought, as opposed to the arbitration panel, that they should be entitled to assert this much against the United States, which the United States said, look, is a figure more than 3 times the size of Antigua's entire economy and was patently excessive. So, because Antigua thought, well, the United States gambling markets would be completely open if the U.S. followed the GATS treaty. And that, of course, how you count the numbers makes a big difference. So while the WTO arbitration panel gave Antigua the authority to engage in cross retaliation, they needed to stick to the number that the arbitration panel recommended would be the maximum they could engage in. Certainly, the trademark infringement violates the Berne Convention, an international agreement that the U.S. and most of these other nations have signed up to for the protection of literary and artistic works, copyrights and all. So this is an ongoing issue, right? So how does it get resolved? Well, believe it or not, conversations are still, ongoing. The U.S. didn't want to withdraw its commitment for gambling services because it wanted to maintain its online domestic horse racing gambling option. So how do these things get resolved? Negotiations, negotiations, negotiations is how it gets done. So this is just merely an illustration for you of, if you will, a trade dispute between one nation and the United States, and how the WTO seeks to remedy these types of disputes, again, as economically reasonable as possible under the circumstances, because again, conflict, is bad for trade. And at the same time, domestic laws of individual countries have to be considered and weighed by the WTO's arbitration panels. So, if I leave you with anything summing up our conversation today, it's that, trade is good for the economy. War and bribery, corruption are bad for business. And when investing abroad, it behooves the would-be investor to thoroughly investigate not just the markets, but the government, the legal system, and certainly the culture of the country you are considering engaging in global business with. Now, having said that, finding a partner, I would suggest, who can align their interests with yours in a credible and honest way is good business, and sensible and careful business. So these are the key issues I wanted to share with you today. As always, if you have any questions that come up, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm here for you. So with that, take care, do well, stay in touch. Bye-bye now.